don't usually win the day, and yet we often acknowledge them as some of the most powerful characters in all of comics. But if they're so powerful, how can they ever lose? Why does M.O.D.O.K often lose, speaking of that question? What makes him so useless? Mainly, it's all in how he's written, I would say, and honestly in his design. His design probably lends to it as well. I mean, he's just a giant head in like a floating chair, you know what I mean? It's his little limbs. M.O.D.O.K though should be a terrifying and intimidating villain, and in some respects and some alternate universe stories he is, but for the most part he is made a mockery of in the comics despite the serious threat behind his name. Initially, George Charlton was a man working for AIM who was experimented on and basically altered to become the ultimate tool for analyzing the cosmic cube, which was in their possession. As a result of his enhanced intellect, his head became massive and he was given a chair to aid him as he was no longer mobile on his own. At least, that's one of his origin stories. The chair that he was given was named the Doomsday Chair, and George became M.O.D.O.K, mental organism designed only for computing. M.O.D.O.K. But AIM failed to predict what other side effects the added knowledge capacity and intellectual power might have on M.O.D.O.K, who turned on those who had made him and ultimately became M.O.D.O.K, with a K instead of a C, to be clear. Mental organism designed only for killing. Despite his kinda epic backstory and the meaning behind his name, I think M.O.D.O.K is often used as a joke villain in the comics. Which villains do you think deserve more respect? How do you feel about villains being used somewhat as comedic relief? I don't know. Me personally, sometimes I like it. I really liked the M.O.D.O.K series. I thought it was really funny, but also sometimes it can work against a character too, and especially like take away from their threat level. So like M.O.D.O.K, Riddler is one of the villains who often just isn't that intimidating. I gotta be real with you. I mean, I love him as a villain and I love his gimmick, but there is honestly something about Batman villains. A lot of them have to have gimmicks, it seems, and for many of them it doesn't add to their capability. In fact, it kinda limits their capability if I'm being honest. Riddler is one of those. At times he can feel unstoppable, like some Mastermind who is many steps ahead of Batman. Although Batman, even if lagging initially, always seems to catch up since he is known for being, you know, the greatest detective in the world. But if you also just took Riddler and put him in a room with Batman and it came down to like a round of fisticuffs, I know where I would place my bets personally. I think you know where you'd place yours too. Being physically fit, simply put, isn't for every villain. This next one included. Mastermind is one of those villains you'd usually never think of when you think of someone that you just like wouldn't want to fight. You'd be like, Mastermind, I guess I'll fight him, it's not that bad. But honestly, he can be pretty dangerous. His mutant powers allow him to alter someone's mind, making them see illusions or even changing their memory in some cases. He was one of the folks responsible for helping to break Jean Grey when she was at the Hellfire Club, and his interference was part of what moved her along on her way to becoming Dark Phoenix. He's also been the person that's kind of been attached to the Void, Sentry's evil persona. That being said, at the end of the day, Mastermind's powers are purely mental, which means that he isn't the most physically intimidating of characters. Also, it was established earlier on in his canon that he actually has to remain focused on the illusion that he's conjuring at all times. Like if he breaks the concentration, then the illusion just disappears. So that's also something to consider, even from a psionic powerhouse standpoint. Oh yeah, and his illusions also, if you like try to touch them, like you can go right through them. So probably won't touch them because that's how good of illusions they are, but if you do see a wall and you decide to run through it, you'll get through it and then the illusion is broken. So you can still break them. They're breakable. Having a powerful mind is of course great, but it doesn't mean that you'll come out on top. Look, Brainiac 5 is often presented as being allergic to Earth's germs, so while he is a powerhouse when it comes to how much knowledge he has and therefore what he can get done, the fact remains that if he decides to come to Earth to face Superman, which is where admittedly Superman usually is, Brainiac can't even really leave his ship. While not all versions of the character turn him into a physical weakling, more have than haven't ultimately. For the most part, he's a villain whose power is his intellect, not his strength and prowess as a fighter. So while he's still an iconic and dangerous Superman villain, in a one-on-one fight, in most instances, Superman easily takes it. Even if a villain can see the future, it doesn't always mean they'll be the most useful in a fight either. Like this next villain. Destiny is honestly one of my favorite characters in the comics right now. Her relationship with Mystique, her dismissiveness sometimes, her sassiness, the fact that she was pretty much one of the only people standing in the way of Sinister taking over initially in Sins of Sinister, all of this and more make her an amazing character to read about. But just because I can acknowledge how great her strengths are, doesn't mean I can't acknowledge her weaknesses too. Destiny is more of a person who advises on fighting than actually does the fighting herself. She doesn't have super strength or endurance or toughness. In fact, up until recently, she was dead for a really long time in the comics, proving just how squishy she is and can be. In a fight that comes to blows, she's not exactly the one you'd want in the middle. Instead, she's often better served kind of staying off to the side, watching and looking to the future for strategies on how best to win here. Seeing the future is one thing, but how about villains who can see into and even control another's mind? Dr. Psycho gained more prominence thanks to his inclusion in the Harley Quinn animated series. Currently in the comics, he's one of Wonder Woman's main foes. That's just how powerful he is. And in the Harley Quinn animated show, he was also revealed to be pretty powerful and even faced off against Harley Quinn using a helmet to amplify his powers, kinda like how he's done before in the comics. With this helmet, he was able to control Darkseid's parademon army. However, the fact remains that while Dr. Psycho can control other physically powerful beings to make them do his bidding, he actually wouldn't be as good himself alone physically in a fight. Without his helmet, the best he can do is actually control 1 or 2 people at most, so against all of the Amazons, let's say, he would be struggling. This next villain has something in common with Dr. Psycho. He also typically gets others to do his bidding. Arcade is pretty messed up when it comes to what he's capable of doing. His main thing is being the guy to make crazy death traps for people to fall into and then later try and escape. And for the most part, he doesn't even really make those necessarily himself. He hires other people. He holds people ransom to basically get them to do his bidding for them. He is the creator of the deranged amusement park-like location known as Murder World. He's kinda like Jigsaw, but without even any moral code. However, I'd argue that both are equally deranged when it comes to their outlook on life and how they choose to treat other people. But I mean, at least John thinks he's doing something that can help people, whereas Arcade kinda just does it because he thinks it's a fun way to kill people, which is his job as an assassin for hire, I suppose. Arcade, however, as an individual, is honestly just a guy. A smart and twisted guy, but ultimately, he's just a man. I would even argue that John Kramer has more of a supernatural aura about him than Arcade does. Pretty weird considering that Arcade comes from a comic book. This next villain is super iconic, which is why I felt a bit bad about including him on my list, to be honest. I'm feeling a little guilty about it, but when you think about it, the fact remains that Lex he's just a guy. I mean, he's a super smart, resourceful, and rich guy, I know, but still, he's just a man. In fact, while Lex boasts of being super intelligent, he's also made honestly some questionable moves in the past. Remember when he could have cured cancer and then he just didn't? The fact that Lex Luthor manages to remain as one of Superman's greatest villains is honestly baffling to me. But it's really something only made possible by the fact that Superman is super good and does not believe in killing. Because if he did, Lex wouldn't stand a chance against him. Moving on to another genius. If you know me, if you know what I like, me, Amanda, you will know that this is one of my favorite evil geniuses. Mr. Sinister was recently proven to be one of the most powerful villains around. He was so powerful, in fact, that he ended up managing to control pretty much everything and created his own version of the world in Sins of Sinister. Of course, this timeline would later be corrected and wiped out, but it's still impressive that he even managed to achieve this. But at the end of the day, Mr. Sinister is ultimately just a scientist. This means that when it comes to bronze, he tends to be kind of lacking. I know he's also usually portrayed as being a really big, kind of deezed guy in some instances, but for the most part, I would say we don't present Mr. Sinister that way, and he doesn't have super strength or anything like that. But he probably takes care of himself. He probably goes to the gym. However, case in point is his fight against his one-time nemesis Tarn the Uncaring, a mutant of Morocco. Now, Tarn is an example of someone who can play with genetics and be deadly in a fight. This is because of his mutant ability to alter the genes of anyone, just like that. Tarn, along with his group known as Locust Vile, were therefore able to make fairly quick work of Sinister and his group of Hellions. Our final point is an interesting one because I feel like you could also make a case for him on a different list. A list where he would be considered the most powerful and unstoppable of villains. And of course, I'm saying that he is powerful here, just not particularly useful in a fight. Sorry, Joker. Joker is a great foil for Batman because he embodies pretty much the opposite of what Batman stands for, and yet there's also a ton of parallels between those characters. If Batman is discipline, control, respect, hard work, and justice, then Joker is disorganized chaos without regard for anyone else or other lives, more prone to throw a plan together haphazardly and messily, and of course a symbol of injustice as the crown prince of crime. It's not to say they don't have parallels, like I said, they're both also highly obsessive people. However, just because he's the opposite of Batman doesn't mean he'd manage to survive in a one-on-one fight against him. When Joker survives his encounters with Batman, it's really only because Batman allows this to be so. Let's be real. Joker might be unpredictable, which makes him a challenging foe for bats, but Batman ultimately has more skills in a single pinky than Joker has pretty much in his entire being, I would wager. That's about it. I've been myself, Amanda, aka Vampex13. Until next time, you stay nerdy, YouTube. Bye!